in the country, but the feeling that Geoffrey Howe had, who really carried the day on that more than her, was that if you don't do it now, you'll never do it, and we must make this big step.
The budget sent out a clear signal of a government, and particularly a Prime Minister, eager to get things done. And it wasn't just spending at home. Margaret Thatcher was also concerned to reduce the size of Britain's contribution to the European Community budget.
They don't agree with talk of summit deadlines or permanent changes in the common market rules to help Britain, as the French Foreign Minister, Monsieur Chesson, told me.
I'm afraid that when Britain say there should be now a new permanent regulation, rule, that we cannot accept. But I'm ready, as member of the French government, to say we accept that during that transition some adjustment should be made in the budgetary contribution.
It would be almost a year before a first reduction would be achieved. It marked a two-thirds cut in the size of Britain's net contribution to the EC budget and the promise of a major review of that contribution the following year.
She didn't really feel that was quite enough, so she was quite angry about that. But actually it was rather good, if the truth be told. But the fact remains that had she not been there and been absolutely adamant in getting that, it wouldn't have happened. I mean, she would, of course, she annoyed a lot of people. I mean, Helmut Schmidt and Giscard d'Estaing used to get rather frustrated by her on the budget, but the fact is that she was absolutely right.
Thatcher's next battle was over the trade unions. She was determined the events of the winter of discontent would not be repeated. Radical reform of trade union law, therefore, was of the utmost priority. Jim Pryor was in charge of introducing the appropriate legislation. But as was evident from his earlier dealings with the unions, he was not one for extreme measures.
Many of the provisions of these codes have been contained in previous TUC or Transport and General Workers Union codes. Now, I think that most people want to see some reasonable discipline in both the closed shop and the way it operates and in picketing.
Jim Pryor was not one to have a head-to-head. He much preferred the step-by-step approach, which became the very famous strapline of his approach.
In autumn 1979, Jim Pryor was ready with an employment bill that outlawed secondary picketing, limited the closed shop, and imposed compulsory ballots before action. It was a sizable package, but in Mrs. Thatcher's eyes it didn't go far enough.
What Jim wanted was to have a measure that would stick. Because don't forget, nobody at this point knew that Margaret Thatcher was going to be Prime Minister for 11 years. There was this feeling, well, would she get re-elected? And Jim's argument was always, well, let's do things which are so blatantly, obviously right that a Labour government wouldn't repeal them if it got the chance.
In the face of Mrs. Thatcher's impatience, and as if to test Jim Pryor's resolve, on the 2nd of January 1980, a national strike began at the National Steel Corporation. The steel workers were demanding a 20% pay rise. The management had offered a 6% increase with tough conditions attached.
The Steelworkers Trade Union, who are my best client, I practiced at the bar, a union which my grandfather helped to found. So one had a great deal of sympathy with them in the difficult situation. But they decided to go ahead, and all we could do was to support the British Steel Corporation. There were some non-nationalised steel companies still in existence, and they were able to trade alongside the strike, so the strike was always unlikely to succeed.
The strike lasted nearly 14 weeks. The plants reopened after the Lever inquiry recommended a package worth 16% in return for an agreement on working practices and productivity deals. Throughout, the government maintained a position of non-intervention, leaving management to manage. But Margaret Thatcher and her allies also made it clear they opposed the action of the unions.
The steel strike was considered to be a win on points for the government. And the reason for this is that though it's true that the sum was much larger than the government wanted, the government had managed to sustain its determination to not to intervene. The great way the unions worked with all the nationalised industries was to create such a rumpus that the people who ran the nationalised industries had to sort of crumple and the government had to come in and sort it out. And the government didn't do that.
The strike had put added pressure on Pryor to take a tougher line in his union reform. As it was, Pryor kept his bill intact.
Margaret always felt that Jim was too cautious. She wanted to move more quickly. But the interesting thing was when Norman Tebbit took over from Jim, he was quite cautious too. He moved rather more slowly than she would have expected him to. And he, in a funny way, although he was a different character from Jim, shared the same view. It was very important to have laws that would stick, rather than play to the gallery and throw in the kitchen sink and give the Labour Party the excuse to repeal them.
A similar challenge to the government was British Leyland, of which Margaret Thatcher would later write, "The company had become a symbol of Britain's industrial decline and of trade union bloody-mindedness."
A lot of them didn't think of me, but having said that...
Once again, workers were on strike.
This cut back in numbers for purely financial reasons as a result of government economic policy, which makes it very difficult for the company to exist at all, is being dealt with in an arrogant and dogmatic fashion by the company.
I remember very well her attitude to British Leyland. First of all, she was absolutely furious with Michael Edwards. I mean, when he came along and effectively asked for £1 billion. And, you know, this was against every instinct that she had. But this was where Margaret was so pragmatic. Margaret knew that the Midlands was full of small and medium-sized companies that made their living by supplying British Leyland.
So, for all Margaret Thatcher's talk of non-intervention in saving failing industries, political expediency overcame government reluctance to provide support. In agreeing to the British Leyland corporate plan, the government also committed itself to providing a further £990 million of state funding.
She made it quite clear that this could never be prayed in aid as a precedent. It was a one-off, and don't come to her and say you did it for British Leyland, now do it for me. And this was where she was very clever. She knew she wanted to get from A to B. She knew you couldn't always get there in a straight line, but she never lost sight, even if you made a detour, of where she was aiming to be at the end.
If Thatcher was unable to prevent industrial unrest in the country, she was also to experience dissent within her own government. Rising unemployment, high inflation and cuts in public spending had split the cabinet. The lines were drawn between Thatcher and her economic team and those who opposed her economic strategy.
It got very personal, you know. I remember once one of the Wets went to lunch in the city, and he was reported to have said the Conservative Party is a cavalry regiment led by a corporal in the Women's Royal Army Corps. And of course this silly man who made that remark thought he could say these things. She'd heard about it within 2 hours because people thought it was a very disloyal remark. And that was an extreme example, but he wasn't the only person with an attitude akin to that.
The cabinet battle would reach its zenith the following year when Chancellor Geoffrey Howe announced his first fully fledged monetarist budget, just at the time the country was in the grip of the deepest recession since the 1930s.